Shannon, and you are tuned to member-supported WPFW, Washington.
This is emPower Hour. I'm your host, Deshauna Spencer. So the Supreme Court's been very busy lately and in the news for a number of cases, but there's one particular case that I don't think has gotten as much attention. That's what we're going to talk about today. It is Utah versus Strieff, which could have implications on the Fourth Amendment rights. And to discuss this decision, in the studio, I have two awesome gentlemen. Todd Cox, he is the Director of Justice Policy for the Center for American Progress, and Christopher Kemmit, he is Senior Counsel for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Gentlemen, welcome to the studio.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thanks, Deshauna.
I'm glad that you're here. If you have any questions or comments during the segment, you can call 202-588-0893 or hit me up on Twitter using the hashtag emPowerHour. So I found out about this case, I want to say last week, actually. I want to say maybe last Thursday. And the reason I saw it is because there was an article, an opinion piece in the Baltimore Sun about Sotomayor's dissent about this particular case. And when I read it, I was like, wait a minute. This can't be true. So for those who do not know much about Utah versus Strieff, just give people some background information about this particular case. If you want to go, Todd or Chris, whichever one.
Go right ahead.
All right. Utah versus Strieff is a case that is basically about police power and what the police can do, or what the consequences are when the police stop you without having a constitutional reason for doing so. So the case came about because Mr. Strieff, who's a resident of Salt Lake City, was just walking out of a house that he'd been in, and he's walking towards a convenience store, and a police officer came up to him, didn't think he'd committed a crime. There was no legitimate constitutional reason to stop him, but he stopped him anyway just to see if Mr. Strieff would talk about what was going on in the house, because they suspected that maybe there was drug activity. So the cops stopped him and took his license and had somebody run an ID check. And it turned out that while they were waiting for the ID check, that Mr. Strieff had a warrant outstanding for his arrest. And he hadn't gone off and raped or killed anybody. He had a minor traffic offense. So based on having that little piddly traffic offense, Mr. Strieff got arrested, and when they were searching him incident to that arrest, they found methamphetamine in his pocket, and he got charged with drug possession. And so the whole case is about, can the police use the meth that they found in his pocket in the criminal prosecution against him? And the reason that they wouldn't be able to is because the police found it in violation of the Constitution.
Right.
The Fourth Amendment said they couldn't stop him, but they stopped him anyway, and they found these drugs on him. But the Utah courts let the drugs in, and the Supreme Court was just answering that question.
And talk about what the courts decided, what the decision was, Todd.
Well, ordinarily, under the Fourth Amendment, if you find evidence pursuant to an illegal stop or illegal search, it's called fruit of the poisonous tree.
Right.
And the courts typically, until now, would not have let that evidence in, or would not allow it to be used against you. There are exceptions to that. So one exception, for example, is if a police officer or a law enforcement official would have found out anyway, found the information out anyway. Another exception is what the court found to be relevant in this case, which is if the evidence or the information they found ultimately is so attenuated, and I find this an odd way of thinking about this, so attenuated from the reason for the stop, it sort of there's a causal break, and therefore, if that evidence was legitimately attained, or a police officer became aware of it legitimately, or the evidence itself is legitimate, such as this warrant, and then that somehow okays the search
Right.
that found evidence that was used against him. I think, just to go forward, I think the opinion, did fly under the radar for most folks. I think that it didn't fly under the radar for Justice Sotomayor.
Right.
And I think she put the relevant issues in play. If I could just read
Yes.
part of what she said, which I thought was really salient. The court today holds that the discovery of a warrant for an unpaid parking ticket will forgive a police officer's violation of your Fourth Amendment. And she really gets down to the bottom line here. She says, don't let basically the court's language soothe you. This case allows the police to stop you on the street, demand your identification, and check it for outstanding traffic warrants, even if you are doing nothing wrong. If the officer discovers a warrant for a fine you forgot to pay, courts will now excuse his illegal stop and will admit into evidence anything he happens to find by searching you after arrest. It's just stunning that
Right.
that's where we are now. And if I may be so bold as to say, because of the ambiguity in some ways this creates, at least in my mind, I can't believe this is going to be the first time we visit this question.
Right, and I was reading an article too about Sotomayor, her concern about our Fourth Amendment rights and the fact that they're being dwindled away. Do you feel like they're being chipped away every couple of years, Chris?
I feel like it's kind of we're in a period where this is a iterated process. This is happening over and over again. The exclusionary rule is basically the rule that makes the Fourth Amendment mean anything. It's the rule that says if the police screw up, if they act against the law, they don't get to benefit from it. They don't get to use that evidence. It's the only thing that really kind of keeps the police in check. And for the last 30 years, the Supreme Court, every few years, comes in and they get a new exclusionary rule case and they narrow it down. And like you said, they whittle it away a little bit here, a little bit there. And I think a little bit more than normal in this instance.
Yeah, I mean, it's really shocking to me when I found out it was a 5-3 ruling, and and we were talking offline the fact that even if Obama's judge, the person that he selected, it could have been 5-4, but it still would have been enough for this case to go the other way. So it also talks about the importance of having the right people on the Supreme Court justice system.
I think that's right. And, the first step, obviously, and this is something of significant concern for CAP and I know for LDF, is making sure we have 9 justices on the Supreme Court.
Right.
Not necessarily to push one outcome or another, but, fully vested Supreme Court is the best way you get the best kinds of discussions and dialogue. A lot goes on before an opinion is decided. Conversations, debates, and you really wonder what's missing when you don't have a full quorum of justices making decisions. And I agree that it seems that our rights in this area are being chipped away, and I believe it's part of a larger frame of just sort of societal concerns post 9/11,
Right.
and I think in some ways a pushback in many ways, or building upon the infrastructure that was created around sort of national security, 9/11, that kind of thing, and in some ways stands in stark contrast to all of the positive bipartisan reform efforts that are occurring in the states and on Capitol Hill, and I can't believe that going forward this won't be part of those discussions.
Right, it does. We're going to add something to that, Chris.
No, I was just going to say you had talked about 9/11 and the way that kind of set us on this particular trajectory.
Right.
But in terms of major news events, in this opinion, it's kind of shocking that the majority opinion doesn't mention Ferguson, doesn't mention Black Lives Matter, doesn't mention any of the current major events that bear directly on the issue that they're talking about here.
Right.
Like, this is being played out in real life right now in people's communities, and it's affecting lots of people's lives. But if you read the majority opinion, you get this totally dry, desiccated legal opinion that's talking about these technical terms, and it's not until you have Justice Sotomayor wade into the fray that you're like, oh, this is the meat of this case.
Right,
this is
right.
what this case is about, and here's why it actually matters to anybody.
And it made me think about Ferguson when I was doing my research about it, because we know what happened. I think maybe it was in 2015 they did the research and found that the police department, they were doing really a poor job in actually targeting people of color and arresting them so they can basically fund the city. So if a case like this is okay, then something like that could happen again.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think that report that you cite it's one of many instances where we find stereotyping, bias at play in our criminal justice system. In that particular instance, or in those instances, it leads to unauthorized stops.
Right.
The other piece of it, although it also is, and what the report found, that these stops were intentionally driven to fill local government's coffers.
Right.
So we have complicated sets of issues and drivers here, all of which are disproportionately impacting people of color. And I think sort of the justice system being fed and being funded by poor people, and people of color in particular, is just at odds not only with our constitutional principles and our values, but also at odds with common sense.
Right.
You're stopping folks who can't afford to pay. In this particular instance, in the Utah case, you have someone who had an outstanding traffic warrant without knowing the facts. Perhaps this person couldn't afford to pay the traffic warrant. If he had been in Ferguson, perhaps he would have been stopped, and perhaps for the traffic warrant itself, and perhaps received additional criminal penalties for a traffic warrant or a traffic violation. And I just believe that we need to do better in our society about figuring out how we pay our local government bills, and try to avoid doing it on the backs of people who can't afford to pay in the first place.
Right. Chris?
I mean, I agree completely with all those sentiments. I feel like this decision is disturbing because basically the Supreme Court is saying, Ferguson Police Department, keep doing what you're doing. We are okay with that.
Wow, and that's why when I saw this case, and I was like, no, this can't be true. Like, I really have to talk about it, because I've been hearing so many other discussions about the immigration case, and of course the affirmative action case. It was on CNN, breaking news, and they had correspondents there talking about it. But for this one, it was just like no conversations about it at all. And I'm like, no, we need to talk about this, because it can have major implications in our communities. And just for people who don't know, the defendant, he's a white guy, and so if that could happen to him, you think about for communities of color, it will be 10 times worse.
That's right. And I think, to your point, I mean, it does point out how the criminal justice system, in some ways, people of color are the canaries in the mines, right? And how a violation that would be disproportionately meted upon or felt by people of color impacts us all.
Right.
I feel also, or think also, that in this particular case, we're talking about stereotyping. We saw, or the facts indicate that this person was suspicious of some activity, and
right.
Whatever stereotypes were in this person's head, he applied it to this individual. I think thinking more broadly about how this impacts African Americans and Latinos and other people of color, you have to wonder what kind of stereotyping goes into police stops in general.
Right.
And that's why I think training around implicit bias and a general effort to try to repair the feelings and the legitimate concerns that communities have with their law enforcement officers is so important.
That's so true. It makes me think, too, about some studies that came out in New York about the racial profiling. Really wasn't very effective. It didn't really result in a lot of people maybe people were arrested, but there were no real charges. So it's like it was for no reason at all, which to me another issue is that people, when they do background checks, and someone can do a background check just to see if you were arrested for anything, you may not have been charged, but that alone can hinder you from getting a job. So there are these long-term implications. What other implications do you think that this particular subject could have on the community as a whole?
Well, I'll just jump in, and I think you sort of touched on one, right? This person didn't have an arrest record. Well, we don't know for sure, but let's say the person didn't have an arrest record. Well, as a result of what some of us believe is a unfortunate, if not errant, decision, he now has an arrest record.
Right.
And as you indicated, criminal records have lifelong impacts on people's lives. And at CAP, we've done some recent studies showing that those impacts extend to children and families. So 1 in 3 people have a criminal record. We now know that nearly half of all American children have at least one parent with a criminal record. That's astounding when you think about it.
Yes, it is.
And the barriers that those individuals face with a criminal record, impacts on the ability to get a job, have housing, get an education, fall to families and children as well. So, the fallout from sloppy, frankly, stereotyped policing, disproportionately impacting people of color, adding criminal records even just for an arrest, can carry lifelong barriers for families as well.
Chris?
I also think that this case is basically saying, look, the police are largely above the law. You and I have to follow the law. People in Ferguson have to follow the law. But the people who are charged with enforcing the law, they don't have to. And it's a dangerous situation when the police know that, and where they're already guided by whatever racism they're bringing to the table, that's led to disproportionate enforcement at this point, that can only get worse when they think that nobody's looking over their shoulders.
Right.
Like, for instance, you were talking earlier about like stop and frisk up in New York. When they looked at when studies were done about what resulted from stop and frisk searches, it actually turned out that people of color had contraband on them, had guns, had drugs less often than white people. So, that is the exact sort of thing that's just going to be exacerbated by this.
Right, exactly. Because if people are stopping people in certain communities looking for certain things versus not going to the white communities at all, then of course black people are going to be proportionally arrested, sometimes for no reason at all. So yeah, you're absolutely right about that. I think there's so many implications. I'm talking to Todd Cox, Director of Justice Policy for the Center for American Progress, as well as Chris Kemmit. He is Senior Counsel for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. If you have any questions or comments, you can call 202-588-0893 or hit me up on Twitter using the hashtag emPowerHour. I don't know a lot about law. It's something that I know about journalism, but definitely not law. Do you think the courts could get confused about this particular case, about what can be included when you talk about evidence and what can't? Or do you see that not being an issue because of this decision? Chris?
I think that I'm a little bit less concerned about the courts getting confused as opposed to the courts now just doing the wrong thing.
Right.
I think that if anything, the court made the law in this specific area a little bit more clear. It just made it worse.
Right.
Now, rather than courts trying to muddle their way through this and figure it out, the Supreme Court said, the Supreme Court basically gave them the green light. They said, go ahead. No, this is something that's okay.
I think that's right, and I think there are implications beyond the courts. So, I talked a bit earlier about how this seems to be at odds with what we hope to be some comprehensive criminal justice reform that is coming, if not tomorrow, very soon at the federal level, but is really rolling out at the states as well. We have police officers and law enforcement officials trying to reform their practices, doing very good training around de-escalation, implicit bias. They're handed a decision like this, and that sort of muddles things, I think, and you want to empower, I think, and give police officers the tools to act properly and enforce the law, but also you don't want to make it harder or more difficult for them to, again, repair the relationships that we know are frayed within our communities. You don't want to incentivize, quite frankly, undermining those relationships. And I think this kind of opinion really doesn't help.
Right. So we do have a caller, if you want to say your name, where you're calling from, your question or comment.
Yeah, Tesfa, here is my comment. The court has become so political, it didn't want the appointment of a new judge because Congress, especially the right-wing senators, did not want a new judge under a democratic president. Now, the court decided the fate of young people born from immigrants in this country and children are suffering. In the same way, the court decided corporations are persons, and now the whole political system and especially working people are suffering. In the United States, the court is not for justice, but the court is a political instrument of the right wing, and this is being learned by other countries, like in Ethiopia. The court is the justice system is an instrument of a genocidal dictatorship.
Thank you so much for your comments, sir. So I will say that people are frustrated. I think people do know that the criminal justice system is obviously broken. And when you hear a decision like this, they feel like, well, what can I do? Is there anything that can be done? Is there anything that can be done beyond this? I mean, Supreme Court, it doesn't get any higher than that. So I do want to give people hope.
Well, I think that you're right. You can't get any higher than the highest court in the land. I do think it in some ways goes back to what I said before. I've been a civil rights lawyer my entire legal career, so I'm not soft on these issues. But I think by and large, police officers want to do the right thing, and they want to enforce the law. They want to keep communities safe, and they certainly don't want to create a situation where they're in a Ferguson set of circumstances. I think going forward, many police departments who are reform-minded want to make sure that they have systems in place and training in place that help repair these relationships. And so I think what we need to do is look to the task force that was done by the administration, where they laid out some best practices for police officers and police departments to adopt, run by the Office of Community Policing, COPS, community-oriented policing. And I think we as citizens can frankly demand our police departments to abide by those best practices and to make the reforms that we need. I think it goes back to democracy.
Right.
And I think our police officers and our police departments need to be responsive to us as citizens.
Right.
And I think if we sort of frame it that way, I think that's one way of empowering ourselves to try to get the right results we want.
So true. Want to add anything to that, Chris?
Just to highlight another aspect of what the caller touched on, there is perhaps the sense of disconnection between the court and between a lot of people who live in the country. And I think that should just provide us with motivation to try and appoint justices who make the court more broadly reflective of the people who live in the country, as opposed to a kind of older, whiter, not representative sample.
Right, so voting is so important. I know people are still not happy about a certain person not getting the nomination, but if you don't vote at all, then things will go in really bad ways. So voting is so important.
Yes, elections have consequences.
Yes, beyond the presidency.
That's right. And I think, one thing we're learning about our criminal justice system is that there is a hunger for reform. There is an interest in reforming. And I think people need to communicate to their members of Congress and Senate and the House that they want these reforms.
Right. So we have another caller. If you want to say your name, where you're calling from, your question or comment.
Yes, my name is Sincere. And I have a comment that I would like to make, followed by a question. My comment is that it's obvious that, and I'm not the first person to say this, that black people are policed and white people are protected. And we need to stop the delusion as if to say, everyone, each time it's always, to my chagrin, I can't believe that's happening. Another black guy has been killed, unarmed. Wasn't doing anything. And it keeps this pretend shock at this when we know that the goal is to pretty much isolate the black race itself, to create a situation where maybe the people who are powerless, which the majority are black, but there are others of every other group that are also part of the powerless. And eventually, I think there's a desire to have an eruption out of frustration. And the other question that I have is, what would be the possibility, and this is just speaking of the court, in the event that there will ever become a tied vote around issues like this, what is the possibility of the court simply allowing one person to not vote so that we will have a 7-member court until another person is confirmed? Thank you.
Thank you. Want to take a stab at that, Chris?
Sure. I think based on what we've seen so far, there's not a lot of historical precedent that tells us exactly how this would play out, but based on what we've seen so far, I don't think that there's any significant likelihood that any of the justices would abstain simply for the purpose of allowing there to be, to allow one side to win. First, there's kind of the practical problem, which is it would have to be somebody who wanted one side to win to step back and permit the other side to win, which I think, people are stubborn and they view their job as their job is to be justices and to stand up for a particular position. But also, just based on what we've seen so far, the court has either split 4-4 in cases where they disagree, or in a couple of instances that they thought were important, they'll just punt cases until the next term on the assumption that at that point they will have a deciding vote.
Right. Interesting. So we do have another caller. If you want to say your name, where you're calling from, and your question or comment.
Okay, this is Bernetta from Northwest. My comment is this. This is a clear-cut of violation by the Supreme Court itself. Therefore, since this is a public peril, we ourselves as the people can forward this to the president, which is the next position in which we move from here, because the court violated the Constitution. All we had to do is show those cases and cites, and some things are just so simple, but it's going to take some task working just to present it. And what you say the name of that case was Utah versus what?
Utah versus Strieff.
How you spell that?
It's, I think, Strief. Am I saying it correctly?
Two Fs. Yep.
Two Fs. Okay, I was close. Strieff.
Okay. Good.
And Google it and read Sotomayor's dissent, because believe me, it's fire. It is definitely fire. Thank you so much for your comments. It's so true. I think thank you so much for your comments, ma'am. I think it's so true when we talk about our amendment rights, and some people on one end of the aisle, especially when we talk about the Second Amendment, when it comes to guns, nothing can be changed, and anything that could take away someone's rights, no, we're not going to do it. But for something like the Fourth Amendment, then it can be chipped away. And I think people are really frustrated and don't quite understand why can one amendment, you can't do anything at all to change it, but then another one can be chipped away until it's gone. Chris or Todd?
No, I mean, I think those are all good points, and it comes down to our democratic system.
Mm-hmm.
I think, as you said, this opinion ran, sort of under the radar. I think that for most people, I think that we as a community, as a society, need to decide what litmus test we want to apply to the next Supreme Court justice. I realize that's not necessarily a politic thing to say. Certainly, no president would say that he or she is applying that test.
Right.
But I think it speaks to our requirement that we want a justice, as I think was referred to before, that understands the importance of the Fourth Amendment, understands, frankly, the small p politics of a decision like this, and what it does to undermine our criminal justice system writ large, and how it really makes us less safe in the long run if people have no confidence in the system. I don't think those questions are not off the table for me in asking my representative, if I had a representative in the Senate, to
I know you're in D.C., right?
I'm a D.C. person, right? Yes. So, but I would definitely inspire those who have representation to ask their senator to ask that kind of question of the next nominee. And I think that, again, I don't want to understate the importance of having 9 justices, to have another voice at the table when they discuss these cases, and not having that voice, not having that perspective, I think makes a difference.
And having diversity too. Of course, we know there's more than one person of color on the court, but I think having diverse voices can make a difference, basically off of Sotomayor. Chris, did you want to add anything to that?
I don't have anything to add except that this just highlights the importance of voting. Like, the only way this is going to change is if you vote for somebody who's going to put a justice on the Supreme Court who believes something consonant with what you believe.
Right, and before we go, I do want to talk a little bit about the Department of Justice and their implicit bias work that they're doing and training. Do you think it's going to really make a difference? I know, to me, it's almost like parallel to the fact that if there was some type of training about implicit bias, and maybe a case like this wouldn't even go as far as the Supreme Court. Todd?
You would hope not, but I think certainly something that we at CAP have called for, among other things, as a way to try to get at resolving or repairing the relationships we discussed before between law enforcement and communities. I think it's a fantastic thing that the Department of Justice is doing. It's limited, obviously, to federal DOJ officials, but it's an example of, number one, the states leading the way. Many states, or a lot of jurisdictions, are doing these kinds of trainings, smart jurisdictions. But I think for those who aren't, it's important to have the Department of Justice provide that kind of leadership. I think that, plus the recommendations that came out of the Community-Oriented Policing Task Force, hopefully will make a difference. And as I said before, it's an odd juxtaposition to have that going on with this opinion.
Yes, yes.
But one hopes that common sense would prevail within the police departments to know the danger, I think, of going too far in impeding in people's civil rights and Fourth Amendment rights.
Right, and I was wondering what's going to happen on an annual basis, but to me, training.
Based on ongoing enforcement occur.
Everything to do implicit bias, effective DOJ. I spirit necessarily the results of that training have come through, whether it's been effective. And if it hasn't been effective, then they need to modify it and change it. It's not just enough to say, we would like to do training. Like,
Right.
That's great, but it's step one.
The results. I think at the end of the day, what will the results be? This has really been a great conversation. We're definitely out of time, but I would definitely have you back on. Hopefully, under better circumstances, we could talk about maybe some good things that have been passed that we can rejoice about and what those implications would be. So we just heard from Ty Cox. He is the Director of Justice for the Center for American Progress, and Christopher Kemmit. He is Senior Counsel for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Up next is my Grassroots Givers, Changing Perceptions. But first is my song of the day, Believer by Kemmit and John Legend. You're listening to emPower Hour on 89.3 FM, WPFW. I'm Deshauna Spencer, your host.